a hyped game fails to meet expectations, the masses will make their disappointment crystal clear. However, there are times when the mob mentality goes too far. The instant there's any hint a release might not be a masterpiece, some people jump on it declaring that it's an unmitigated disaster. Now, the entries on this list aren't perfect, however they have so many redeemable qualities it's obvious they didn't deserve the level of animosity they received at the time. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com and here are 10 hated video games that became cult classics. Number 10, Mega Man 7. After the whirlwind success of Mega Man 2, Capcom churned out a plethora of sequels hoping to milk the Blue Bomber for everything he was worth. Sadly, looking back at Mega Man 3, 4, 5 and 6, it's obvious they altogether didn't bring too much new to the table, causing the platforming franchise to stagnate. Although Capcom hoped Mega Man 7 would reinvigorate the series, it was criticised for being formulaic and dated. The towering success of the rebooted Mega Man X, which was released 2 years earlier, further highlighted how obsolete the classic series had become. But upon revisiting Rockman's 7th outing, it's clear it shouldn't have been discounted. Even though Mega Man 7 follows the same formula as its forebears, the gameplay is far more diverse. The instant the game begins, it's obvious the developers put more focus on story, humour, and Rock's relationship with his allies. 7 boasts a hoard of secrets that can only be found with specific power-ups, encouraging players to revisit completed areas after obtaining the desired item. The inclusion of a shop is clever since it compels players to seek out currency and strategize which upgrades will give the heroic android the best chance of survival. With its catchy tunes, creative level design, imaginative enemies, tricky bosses, and innovative weapons, it's hard to believe Mega Man 7 was considered a misfire. Number 9, Max Payne 3. Because the franchise went into a hiatus for almost a decade after Max Payne 2, it would have been easy for the developers to toss out more of the same, knowing that nostalgic fans would lap it up. But when Rockstar took over development for Max's third adventure, they decided to overhaul everything. While the first 2 installments were known for their atmospheric setting, cheesy dialogue, and panelized storytelling, Max Payne 3 shifted to a more linear and cinematic style. Our titular hero's appearance and wisecracking demeanour also received a major revision. Even though these alterations showcase the evolution of our cynical hero and the franchise in general, die-hard fans were disappointed this long-awaited sequel didn't resemble the preceding entries. But judging Max Payne 3 on its own merits, there's next to nothing that can be faulted. Thanks to the vibrant colours and realistic graphics, this adrenaline-pumping high-octane action game has never looked better, especially during the bullet time sections, which have been refined to perfection. Although the hard-boiled detective tropes were deliberately parody in the previous installments, Max Payne 3's gripping narrative keeps things more grounded without compromising the noir elements. Looking at Max Payne 3 with fresh eyes, it's apparent that it's not just a marvellous title, but some might even say that it's the best of the trilogy. Number 8, Batman Arkham Origins. Because Rocksteady's Batman Arkham Asylum and Arkham City were borderline perfect, it felt like the prequel, Arkham Origins, couldn't match them. Fans were extra cynical since this follow-up was handled by Warner Bros. Games Montreal, a company so green it didn't even exist before Arkham. And with classic voice actors Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill not returning, skepticism for Origins was through the roof. Sadly, these concerns were apt. Origins did little to distinguish itself since the setting, weapons and mechanics remained mostly unchanged from the previous entries. Also, there were technical issues and the game froze so often you'd swear Mr. Freeze was to blame. Roger Craig Smith and Troy Baker taking over as Batman and Joker respectively was so good that only the most die-hard Batman fans could tell the difference. The story explores the Joker's origins in a way rarely seen in any game before or since. It has some genuinely heart-wrenching moments, especially between Bruce Wayne and Alfred. Also, the boss battles are top-notch. Rather than tangling with a legion of random goons, the boss battles in Origins has the Dark Knight fight actual bosses. And after the disastrous reception of Batman Arkham's successor Gotham Knights, Origins is now looking like the unsung hero of the series, giving fans more incentive to revisit it. Number 7, Zelda 2: Adventures of Link. The top-down view has been a staple in The Legend of Zelda, dating all the way back to the original. However, Nintendo decided to mix it up for the sequel, since nobody really knew what video game sequels were in the 80s, turning The Adventures of Link into a side-scroller. The universal response was so overwhelmingly negative that Zelda 2 was hailed as the worst installment in the series for a very long time. But with the benefit of hindsight, there's no question the rabble were too quick to judge this entry. Considering the franchise has stood the test of time by constantly reinventing itself, it's ironic Zelda 2's biggest criticism was the fact that it was too different. Many people who hate on the game never gave it a chance since they switched it off when they saw it didn't follow the original's format. By playing Zelda 2 for no more than an hour, any player can see how appealing and innovative it is. It was among the first games ever to effectively blend platforming and role-playing together. Fighting enemies rarely feels like a slog thanks to the ability to enhance weapons, armor, magic and health. NPCs have their own patterns and movements, accentuating the game's world building. And Zelda 2 introduced many key components to the franchise, including the Triforce of Courage, Metered Magic and Dark Link. Number 6. Street Fighter 3. Because Street Fighter 2 single-handedly moulded the fighting game genre into what it is today, it seemed impossible for any follow-up to have the same impact. Sadly, the overwhelming meh that Street Fighter 3 received verified this notion. Critics found this installment to be solid, but nothing special. At the time, other fighting titles like Tekken and Soul Edge had embraced the third dimension. Because Capcom's sequel firmly maintained its 2D roots, it looked ancient by comparison. But nowadays, Street Fighter 3 isn't considered dated. Ironically, it's now regarded as ahead of its time. Unlike fighters like Marvel vs. Capcom or Mortal Kombat, this threequel doesn't rely on showy moves, over-the-top combos or screen-filling attacks. Instead, it focuses on fighting in its purest form. During each match, competitors have to constantly think about positioning, timing and parrying rather than wailing on their opponent with cheap attacks. Street Fighter 3's mechanics are so precise it gave birth to the Diego Parry incident, which is considered not just the best counter in video games, but the defining moment in competitive gaming history. Number 5. Days Gone. Critics were quick to peg Days Gone as just another sandbox title chastising its empty open world, minimal exploration, one-dimensional protagonist and filler quests. Because of this, it looked like the zombie fighting title would be quickly forgotten. On the contrary though, it got a second wind. Even though Days Gone only received middling scores from the press, the populace were far more generous, rating the post-apocalyptic adventure much higher on Metacritic. Bizarrely, players seemed to enjoy everything that the critics didn't. Rather than seeing Deacon St. John as a boring hero, fans thought the outlaw biker was relatable and uncliched. Yes, the open world is sparse, but this makes it easy to admire the terrain's beauty, especially while zooming around on a motorbike. The gameplay is anything but generic since players must manage resources, navigate hostile environments, strategically fight off mutant monsters, and devise tactics to survive encounters with human adversaries. Even though it can take a decade for a game to be considered a cult classic, Days Gone achieved that status in record time. Despite only being released 4 years ago, the rabid fanbase are already pining for more. Number 4. Doom 64. Doom dominated the FPS genre during the 1990s, causing the hellish shooter to be ported to every system that could run it. Rather than dragging and dropping Doom onto the Nintendo 64, however, id Software collaborated with Midway to devise a brand new installment called Doom 64. Boasting a new engine, a bevy of rock-hard levels, and all new sprites for enemies, this N64 exclusive was shaping up to be one for the ages. Sadly, the demon-blasting title failed to take the world by storm, with Nintendo shooters at the time like Turok and GoldenEye towering over their competition. Doom 64 looked like a dusty relic. But on further inspection, it's obvious Doom 64 was more than a copy and paste of the original. Instead of focusing on fast-paced action, this entry relies on atmosphere and ramping up tension. Rather than murdering everything in sight, there's a bigger emphasis on solving puzzles. Because of this, battling the denizens of hell is far less frequent, which makes each encounter more shocking since it's hard to know when the creepy critters will show up. Over the years, Doom 64 has developed such a devoted cult following, it's been ported and modded on multiple systems. Even though Doom 64 is meant to be a spin-off, it captures the spirit of the franchise perfectly, which is why many players perceive it more like Doom 3 than the actual Doom 3. Number 3. Killer 7. Video game director Goichi Suda has a gift for crafting underrated gems. Even though he's renowned for his work on the Silver Case, No More Heroes and Lollipop Chainsaw, it took years before any of these titles received any recognition. And nothing demonstrates Suda's unappreciated legacy more than Killer 7. In a nutshell, Killer 7 is a puzzle-themed shooter with on-rail controls where the paralysed protagonist conjures assassins from his mind to complete missions. So unsurprisingly, it wasn't an easy game to market. With its cel-shaded visuals, noir style, art house imagery, unconventional controls and confusing premise, it was like Suda tried to make the project as niche as possible. Because this bonkers FPS went so far against the grain, it was no surprise it didn't gel with the general population. However, Killer 7's biggest criticism is also its greatest strength. There's nothing else like it. Although many people found the gameplay inaccessible, just as many loved its absurd uniqueness. Even though Killer 7 could have fallen apart trying to juggle too many eccentric ideas, it pulls it off for the most part, offering players an experience unlike any other. Number 2. Assassin's Creed 3. Based on the mesmerising promos and trailers, Assassin's Creed 3 was expected to be the capstone of Ubisoft's iconic series. Sadly, the third entry in the parkour leaping time-hopping tale was hampered by various issues. Glitches and long loading times interfered with the immersion. Connor was a compelling hero, but he couldn't compete with Assassin's Creed 2's Ezio, and even though Desmond Miles' death should have been heartfelt, it was surprisingly anticlimactic. Although AC3 isn't a bad game, it was regarded the runt of the litter for years. This is a pity since this installment exceeds other entries in many aspects. The combat has been fine-tuned, the weapons are astoundingly diverse, and the world building is magnificent. Although Connor lacks the swagger of Ezio, he's a far more relatable protagonist. By playing as the villain during the prologue, players got the chance to see the assassin's conflict from the enemy's point of view, giving them greater insight in the overarching narrative. This was also a genius bait and switch, since many players initially assumed the dastardly Haytham Kenway was the hero. Speaking of which, Haytham is arguably the best villain in the entire saga. Despite being a smug know-it-all, it's tough not to be swayed by his words purely because of the monumental performance. Assassin's Creed 3 is by no means the best the franchise has to offer, but it's far from the worst. And number 1, Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is the precursor, of course, to the Dark Souls games, the tentpole of From Software and the pioneer of the Souls-like games. Due to its legacy, it's easy to forget nobody gave a damn about Hidetaka Miyazaki's open-world IP when it first came out. Even Shuhei Yoshida, Sony's president at the time, thought it was a, quote, unbelievably bad game, end quote. Being the devil's advocate, it's not surprising to understand why Demon's Souls didn't gain traction straight away. With its lack of tutorials and merciless difficulty, the majority of players gave up before breaching the starting area. The world building is so subtle, casual players couldn't make heads or tails of the detailed lore, nor could they get the hang of the trial and error combat. Since Demon's Souls came out the same month as Assassin's Creed 2 and Modern Warfare 2, it looked like the grueling title would get lost in the shuffle. Slowly but surely though, the fantasy role player started making a name for itself through the oldest method possible: word of mouth. Seeing its potential, the developers got cracking on its spiritual successor Dark Souls, which launched the subgenre into the stratosphere. Even though the original Demon's Souls is a bit rough around the edges, it's apparent how this medieval marvel shaped the modern world of gaming. Speaking of cult classics, there are many video games that just get lost to time. Check out this list on screen now for 10 video games that time forgot, but we haven't. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment down below about other various cult classics that have got their reputation turned around. Don't forget to subscribe, head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.